My name is Elena Vance. I am 32 years old, and for the last 4 years of my life, I have been the invisible black sheep of the Vance family. To the elite country club circles that my parents frequent, I was always introduced with a sigh, as the quiet, stubborn daughter who chose spreadsheets over family loyalty. But outside of their artificial bubble, I am the managing director of a commercial infrastructure holding firm that designs, structures, and licenses premium boutique retail properties across 3 states. I know the exact structural cost of a square foot of Italian marble, the zoning laws of prime downtown blocks, and the interest rates of a $20 million line of credit, the way most people know their own phone numbers or their children's birthdays. So, on a humid Tuesday evening, when my phone buzzed after 4 years of absolute, freezing, radio silence from my mother, I felt a familiar cold sensation settle behind my ribs. I opened the notification. It was an invitation, a message filled with warm, carefully curated, and almost heavily rehearsed words. My mother wrote that she and my stepfather had been doing a tremendous amount of soul-searching. They wanted to invite me to a private, luxury dinner at the Grandview Manor, the most expensive historic estate restaurant on the coast, to put the past behind us, heal the old wounds, and start fresh as a family. 30 seconds later, a second text arrived from her, containing the exact 5-word thesis statement that had governed my entire childhood. Family takes care of family, sweetheart. It's time we remembered that. When I read those words, I should have stopped. I should have locked my phone, turned around, and asked one highly clinical, logical question before I ever put my keys in the ignition. Who engineered the guest list, and what is the real price of this reconciliation? But I didn't ask. The human brain is a fragile thing, and despite years of professional distance, a small part of me wanted to believe that 4 years of absence had actually changed the foundation of my family. I drove 45 minutes up the coast in the pouring rain. I dressed simply on purpose. A plain charcoal blazer, tailored slacks, flat shoes, and absolutely no jewelry except for the simple steel watch I bought myself the day I cleared my very first independent corporate escrow. I didn't want to walk into that room looking like I was performing success. My family already claimed I flaunted my achievements. But the moment I pushed open the heavy, oak-paneled double doors of the Grandview Manor's private ballroom, the thick scent of vintage champagne, imported truffles, and unchecked social entitlement hit my face like a physical wall. There wasn't a quiet, intimate family reconciliation of 3 waiting for me. There were 14 members of my extended family already seated around a 20-foot mahogany table. The surface was completely covered in ice platters of black caviar, prime rib roasts, gold leaf appetizers, and empty bottles of a $600 vintage Italian wine that they had already finished pouring and drinking long before my truck had even cleared the valet parking lot. My stepfather, Raymond, sat at the head of the table like a king presiding over a court. He looked up, adjusted the heavy gold signet rings on his fingers, flashed a wide, artificial smile, and delivered the exact line they had spent weeks engineering in their private group chats. "Elena, sweetheart, you're handling the corporate ledger tonight, right? After all, family takes care of family." The entire table broke into a synchronized chorus of soft, expectant, pitying smiles. My half-sister, Chloe, smirked from her velvet seat, her smartphone already tilted at an angle, waiting to record my submission. They thought they had designed the ultimate social trap. They believed that the quiet, non-confrontational daughter wouldn't dare cause a scene in front of the city's high society elite. What they hadn't counted on, what they hadn't bothered to check, was that I didn't just design buildings. They had absolutely no idea about the legal restructuring notice and the debt acquisition forms I had signed on my corporate desk just 48 hours prior to walking into this room. Welcome back to Silent Storm Stories, where ordinary people face calculated family ambushes and walk out with the entire building. If you've ever been treated like an open bank account by people who completely ignored your existence until their own debts came due, take a deep breath, hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment below. Because tonight, the performance is officially over, and the credit lines are frozen solid. To understand the absolute certainty sitting at that mahogany table, you have to understand the specific, cold currency of the Vance family. In my parents' house, affection was never a gift. It was a high-interest loan. When you were yielding a high social return for them, you were placed in the front display window to be shown off to their country club friends. When you demanded structural logic, accountability, or refused to let them liquidate your hard work to finance their illusions, you were treated as a liability, written off the books, and completely removed from the family circle. 4 years ago, the fracture occurred because of my half-sister, Chloe. Chloe was the golden child, a girl whose entire life had been cushioned by my parents' desperate need to appear wealthy. She decided, on a complete whim, that she wanted to launch an independent, luxury fashion boutique downtown. She didn't have an operational framework, she didn't have a market analysis, she didn't have a logistics budget, and she hadn't secured a single reliable supplier network. She had simply visited a high-end showroom in Miami with gold fixtures, silk drapes, and minimalist lighting, and thought to herself, I could be a creative director. The commercial landlord of the premium retail space she wanted demanded a $90,000 personal corporate guarantee to secure the 5-year lease. Because my parents' own finances were a chaotic web of credit card balancing acts and second mortgages, they turned to me. They naturally assumed that my corporate signature, my pristine credit rating, and my hard-earned business capital would appear on the dotted line without a single question. I sat down with them in their living room, looking at the lease documents. I didn't yell. I didn't start an argument. I simply asked to see Chloe's projected cash flow statements. I asked about her break-even point, her inventory turnover rates, and her liability insurance. Chloe didn't answer. Instead, she stared at me as if I had personally insulted her character, her eyes filling with tears. My stepfather, Raymond, stood up so quickly his chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He slammed his fist against the glass table, his face turning a dark, furious red, and delivered the sentence that officially ended our relationship for the next 4 years. You've become cold and corporate, Elena. You care more about your mechanical spreadsheets and your sterile numbers than your own sister's dreams. If you won't back this family when we ask, then you don't belong under our roof, and you don't belong in our lives. The very next morning, I discovered I had been blocked from every single digital family channel, group chat, and photo-sharing album. For over 1,000 days, I was the greedy, heartless daughter who had abandoned her family for corporate greed. My parents went ahead and financed Chloe's boutique themselves by taking out a high-interest secondary lien against their own residential property. Predictably, without an operational foundation, the boutique collapsed into absolute financial ruin exactly 14 months after the grand opening, leaving behind a massive trail of unpaid commercial debt, broken supplier contracts, and a pending foreclosure notice from the bank. And yet, here they were tonight at the Grandview Manor, surrounded by prime rib, caviar, and $600 wine, putting on a spectacular, aggressive performance of high society luxury. It was a desperate, exhausting attempt to mask a financial house that was actively burning down to the ground. As I sat down in the empty velvet chair at the far end of the long table, the visual irony of the room was striking. 14 people were indulging in a lavish feast without a single glance at the right-hand column of the menu, while I sat quietly with nothing but a single glass of plain ice water. Aunt Sarah leaned across her husband, Uncle Greg, her diamond-encrusted bracelet clinking loudly against her porcelain plate. Must be absolutely wonderful running an entire commercial development firm, while the rest of us are struggling with basic market adjustments. Elena, she said, her voice laced with that sharp, artificial cackle people use when they want you to know they are being completely serious. My cousin Marcus chimed in from the middle of the table, asking if I ever felt a sense of personal guilt living so comfortably while my parents were facing temporary economic realignments. An alignment that no one had ever bothered to tell me about. Chloe, without even looking up from her smartphone screen, added in a loud whisper, "She wouldn't know, Marcus. Elena only shows up when she wants to look important in front of people." Every single comment landed with the precise, practiced rhythm of a calculated ambush. They hadn't invited me to heal. They had arrived tonight with a pre-established narrative that had been discussed, refined, and agreed upon in my absence. Elena left. Elena has millions. Elena owes us the balance. I watched the young server, a kid named Leo who couldn't have been older than 20, moving frantically around our massive 14-top table. He was pale, his shirt collar slightly damp from sweat, running entirely on pure nervous energy, and the exhausting fear of a hospitality worker who knows that a large, high-society party can ruin his entire week's income with a single negative report to the general manager. Every time my stepfather snapped his fingers in the air to demand another bottle of premium wine, Leo moved with instant, trembling precision. I caught his eye as he carefully refilled my plain ice water. "Tough room," I murmured quietly, keeping my tone gentle. "Just trying to keep the pacing right, ma'am," he whispered back, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the silver pitcher. "They've been ordering continuously for an hour and a half." I knew his position perfectly. I had worked those exact double shifts when I was putting myself through corporate design school, learning how to survive the arrogance of customers who treated the service staff like furniture. But that version of me was gone. The woman sitting here tonight was an executive who knew exactly how much a family ambush cost before the bill was ever printed. By the 1-hour mark of the dinner, the emotional manipulation inside the private room was becoming physically suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of expensive food and cheap intentions. Every toast my stepfather made, every laugh from Aunt Sarah, was a calculated psychological layer designed to pressure me into a state of guilt. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to believe that my financial success was a crime against the family peace, a crime that could only be pardoned by writing a massive check. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a few minutes of absolute, unyielding clarity away from the theater. The Grandview Manor's restroom was a massive, sterile suite of white calicut marble, gold fixtures, and custom lavender lighting. I turned on the brass faucet, pressing freezing water against my wrists, watching my heart rate stabilize in the mirror. I forced myself to breathe deeply, resetting the emotional boundaries I had spent 4 years constructing. As I reached for a cloth towel near the wash basin, I noticed a sleek, gold-rimmed smartphone sitting carelessly on the edge of the marble vanity. It had a bright pink designer case covered in luxury brand stickers. Chloe's phone. She had left it behind, a permanent, unchangeable habit of a girl who had spent her entire existence expecting someone else to follow behind her and pick up her scattered wreckage. The screen was completely unlocked, fully illuminated, displaying a live notification from a private group text message titled The Restoration Project. The members of this private group were only 3: my mother, my stepfather Raymond, and Chloe. I picked up the device. I did not do it out of a sense of petty curiosity or anger, but with the cold, diagnostic, and clinical focus of a commercial property inspector examining a severe structural defect in a foundation. I scrolled upward through the text threads spanning the past 2 weeks, and the reality of the dinner unfolded in stark, digital print. My mother's text message from Tuesday morning read, "Make sure Elena doesn't find out the whole extended family is attending the dinner. Once she is physically trapped at the table with 14 people watching her, she won't dare refuse to cover the balance. She has always lacked the stomach for public scenes." My stepfather's response followed immediately below it, time-stamped an hour later. "The Grandview manager already has my old corporate credit card on file just to hold the ballroom reservation, but that line is completely maxed out. Make sure she sits directly to my right. I'll deliver the final pitch for the commercial bailout once the wine has softened her up." Chloe's contribution was laid out perfectly minutes later. "Order all the premium caviar platters and the $600 Italian vintage before she even arrives in the parking lot. Once the food is physically on the table and half-eaten, she can't exactly walk out without looking like a monster." Lol, I kept scrolling further down the digital ledger of their deception. A message from my mother sent 8 days ago read, "The primary mortgage bank called again this morning. If we don't clear the secondary lien from the boutique failure by next month, they will officially initiate the foreclosure on our house. Elena's commercial cash reserves can clear our entire balance in one single wire transfer. We just have to make her feel like she's part of the family again." And then, the final line of absolute, unyielding arrogance from my stepfather Raymond, which closed the thread. "We aren't asking her for a handout. We are giving her a rare chance to buy her way back into this family's good graces. She should be profoundly grateful we are even throwing her this financial lifeline. Grateful. They wanted me to feel a deep, heavy debt of gratitude for the honor of being systematically manipulated into a 14-person corporate ambush. They wanted me to feel privileged to settle a commercial bankruptcy that I had actively, explicitly warned them against 4 years ago. They expected the child they had completely erased from their lives to turn into their ultimate financial savior on command, simply to protect their vanity at the country club. I set Chloe's phone back down on the cold marble counter exactly where I had found it, screen down, matching its original position to the millimeter. I looked at myself in the mirror. My pulse was completely steady. My hands were perfectly dry. The old childhood fixer reflex, the survival mechanism that had spent decades smoothing over every parental crisis, financing every hidden debt just to keep the dinner table quiet, fired one last time in my chest. Just sign the check, Elena. Pay the money. Make the storm go away. But I looked at the steel watch on my wrist. I remembered the 4 years of absolute, freezing cold silence. I remembered the holidays spent alone in my condo while they posted photos of family vacations funded by secondary debts. The machine was officially out of service. I walked back out into the oak-paneled ballroom. My face was completely calm, pleasant, and fully operational. I sat back down in my velvet chair, picked up my glass of plain ice water, and watched the family dynamic with entirely new eyes. The trap was fully set, the audience was smiling, and the premium dessert menus were just being distributed by the staff. They truly believed the transaction was already complete. They had no idea that the bill they had generated wasn't going to land where they planned. As the dessert plates were cleared, the atmosphere in the private ballroom shifted from artificial celebration to tactical positioning. The final phase of their architecture was moving into place. My stepfather, Raymond, leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit jacket. He cleared his throat. A specific, heavy sound I had heard him make before signing bad contracts, before delivering empty speeches, and before telling me at 23 that I was selfish for wanting to save my own money instead of buying him a new boat. He looked across the length of the mahogany table, his eyes locked onto mine with the absolute confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Elena, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the soft music playing in the background. "You're handling the ledger tonight, right? You owe us that much for bringing the family back together." The entire table went dead silent. 14 faces froze, their eyes shifting between Raymond and me, waiting for the predictable submission they had spent 2 weeks planning. My mother offered a soft, rehearsed nod of encouragement. Chloe smirked, taking a slow sip of her vintage wine. Aunt Sarah clutched her wine glass, her face bright with expectation. I didn't answer right away. One of the greatest assets I have acquired in the high-stakes world of commercial real estate development is the mastery of absolute silence. In a room full of people who are desperate for compliance, a prolonged silence acts like an environmental vacuum. It strips away their confidence, forces them to squirm in their seats, and makes their engineered performances collapse under their own weight. 3 seconds passed, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The silence stretched so long that Uncle Greg shifted uncomfortably, his silverware clinking accidentally against his plate. My mother's smile began to falter at the edges, the lines of deep financial anxiety around her eyes showing through her heavy makeup. They expected a defense. They expected me to argue, to complain about the price, or to make the very public scene they had prepared to use against me. They had absolutely no frame of reference for a woman who simply sat there, completely calm, looking at them with the detached, clinical observation of a bank auditor checking an empty vault. For 15 years of my life, I had paid their social tax. I had financed their vanity, co-signed their car notes, and covered their medical expenses because the emotional cost of saying no was a room exactly like this one, a room full of cold, judging faces accusing me of greed. But tonight, the mathematics of our relationship had fundamentally changed. The price of admission to my own family had been printed on a Grandview Manor ticket, and for the first time in my 32 years, I looked at the total balance and decided the investment was worth absolutely nothing. I set my water glass down on the white linen table with a soft, distinct click. I looked my stepfather directly in the eyes, my expression entirely unreadable, and stood up from my chair. "Let me go take care of the details," I said softly. The tension in the room broke instantly like a snapped cable. My mother exhaled a massive breath she had been holding. Aunt Sarah patted her chest with a laugh, and Raymond unlocked his arms, leaning forward with the smug satisfaction of a conqueror. They truly believed that the quiet daughter had broken under the weight of their social pressure. They thought I was walking out to the front register to surrender my corporate card. They had no idea that I was about to walk into the back office and execute a completely different set of instructions. I didn't turn left toward the front reception desk, where the wealthy patrons usually stood to settle their tabs. I walked straight past the grand display cases of vintage crystals and moved directly toward the service station at the back of the dining hall. There, behind a polished mahogany divider, stood David, the floor manager of the Grandview Manor. He was wearing the standard elite uniform, a crisp black shirt, a tailored black tie, and a subtle communication earpiece. Beside him was Leo, our young, exhausted server, who was currently organizing check presenters with hands that were still visibly shaking from the stress of managing our chaotic 14-top table. Both of them looked up as I approached. In the high-end hospitality industry, there is a specific, immediate recognition when you encounter someone who operates at the executive level. They didn't see a flustered customer looking to complain. They saw a woman who moved with total operational authority. "Excuse me, David," I said, keeping my voice at a low, measured volume, the exact decibel level used in corporate boardrooms when a sensitive correction needs to be executed without alerting the rest of the room. "I need to make a permanent operational adjustment to table 4. David adjusted his earpiece, giving me his undivided attention. "How can I assist you, ma'am?" "I am Elena Vance," I said, maintaining absolute, freezing eye contact. "I am the managing director of Vanguard Development Trust. I am not the host of this evening's gathering, and my corporate accounts will not be covering a single dollar of the main bill. Please present the complete, itemized final folio directly to the gentleman sitting at the head of the table, Raymond Vance. His personal credentials and an old corporate card are already on file to secure the ballroom reservation." David blinked once, his mind processing the legal and financial reality of the statement. He looked at Leo, who was holding the ticket containing multiple rounds of imported caviar and $600 bottles of wine. "And the second detail," I continued, sliding my private personal credit card onto the counter with a soft click. "I want you to split my individual order, one single glass of plain ice water, onto its own separate check. Run my card for that water right now, and I want you to apply a guaranteed 30% gratuity directly to Leo and the kitchen staff for their endurance tonight. They have performed exceptionally well under difficult conditions." Leo's eyes widened to the size of saucers. A 30% tip on a 14-top luxury order at the Grandview Manor was more than he usually earned in a weekend of double shifts. David looked at my card, then looked back at my face, reading the absolute, unyielding finality in my eyes. A seasoned manager doesn't argue with a client who speaks in the language of clear legal directives. He swiped my card, handed me the tiny receipt to sign, and slid the plastic back across the counter. "The water check is settled, Miss Vance," David said, his voice dropping into a tone of profound professional respect. "I will personally ensure that the main folio is delivered directly to the head of the table in exactly 10 minutes, right after the final premium dessert course is cleared from the room." "Perfect," I replied, sliding the pen back into my blazer pocket. "Make sure it is fully itemized." I walked back into the oak-paneled ballroom with the slow, rhythmic step of an executive returning to a closing meeting. I sat back down in the velvet chair, picked up my fresh glass of ice water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Around me, the family performance was reaching its peak. My half-sister Chloe was loudly arguing with cousin Marcus about the layout of a reality television star's mansion. Aunt Sarah was laughing hysterically at a golf joke Uncle Greg had told 3 times before. My mother was watching me with a look of absolute, smug triumph, believing that the financial threat to their household had just been neutralized by my submission. Raymond sat at the head. His chest expanded, radiating the artificial authority of a man who believed his stepdaughter's wallet had just saved his country club reputation. 14 people were sitting around a table covered in the wreckage of a feast they had no intention of funding. They had engineered the perfect social trap, using 3 years of silence and the pressure of a public setting to force my hand. They simply hadn't realized that while they were busy ordering the dessert, the trap had already snapped shut on the other end of the room. Exactly 9 minutes later, the heavy double doors of the private ballroom opened. Leo entered, carrying a single, leather-bound check presenter embossed with the gold crest of the Grandview Manor. The young server didn't glance at the middle of the table, and he didn't look toward my end. He walked with a straight, clinical posture directly to the head of the table and placed the folio flat on the mahogany wood, right in front of my stepfather, Raymond. The conversation at the table died instantly, like a candle caught in a sudden, freezing draft. Raymond stared down at the leather folder. For a fraction of a second, his brain experienced a total operational failure. The script had been broken. In his mind, the bill was supposed to be processed at the service station on Elena's account. The leather presenter was supposed to be invisible. My mother's face went entirely still, her eyes darting between the folder, Raymond, and my calm expression at the far end of the table. The plastic smile she had worn all evening cracked, exposing the raw, desperate terror of a woman who knew her household was single weeks away from a judicial foreclosure notice. Elena, my mother started, her voice shaking slightly, trying to maintain that warm, performative tone. Sweetheart, didn't you go to the back, too? Raymond recovered first. He had spent 63 years of his life engineering an illusion of absolute financial dominance, and he was not going to allow his composure to dissolve in front of 14 members of his social circle. He let out a loud, forced laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the oak panels. Don't worry about it, everyone, Raymond announced, his voice booming with forced generosity. It seems there was a minor routing mix-up at the register. I've got the ledger handled tonight. After all, we're celebrating a family reconciliation, remember. He pulled his primary credit card from his premium leather wallet with that same arrogant, two-finger flourish he had practiced all evening. He dropped the plastic into the presenter and handed it back to Leo without breaking eye contact with me, his jaw tightening into a hard, dangerous line. Process it immediately, young man. Right away, sir, Leo said softly, taking the folio and stepping back out of the room. The table tried to resume its laughter, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. The performance was unraveling. The cousins were whispering to each other, Aunt Sarah was suddenly very focused on her diamond rings, and my half-sister Chloe had finally set her phone face down on the table, her eyes narrowing as she glared at me. 4 minutes passed. To a room full of people waiting for a credit card to return, 4 minutes feels like an eternity in a concrete cell. The double doors opened again. Leo walked back into the room, his face completely expressionless, carrying the leather folder. He didn't drop it. He leaned down beside Raymond's chair, his voice perfectly polite, professional, and entirely audible to a room that had gone quiet enough to hear the ice melt in my glass. I am deeply sorry, sir. The transaction was declined by the processing network. It returned an insufficient funds code. Nobody moved. Raymond's face froze into a terrifying mask of controlled fury. The artificial smile stayed, stamped on his lips for 1 more second. A biological reflex like a light bulb that stays burning hot for a moment after the power line has been cut. That's ridiculous, Raymond hissed, his voice dropping into a sharp, dangerous register. There is a temporary commercial hold on that account due to a major real estate transaction. Run it again as a standard line. We did attempt it twice, sir, Leo replied gently, his voice devoid of judgment but carrying the weight of total finality. The network refused the authorization. Do you have an alternative card you would like to provide for the balance? Raymond's hands began to shake slightly as he opened his wallet again. His fingers scrambled through the leather slots, pulling out a silver card, then a corporate credit line, then a secondary personal card he had tucked behind his driver's license. The absolute last bullet in a financial chamber he had spent years pretending was full to the brim. He shoved them into Leo's hands. "Run them all. Find the one that clears." The ballroom turned into a vacuum of suffocating silence. 14 members of the Vance family sat in total paralysis. No forks were moving, no wine was being poured, and no one dared to look at Raymond's face. They were watching the absolute, public compression of a 63-year-old man's manufactured pride into a wallet he could no longer close fast enough. Leo returned a third time. He didn't even need to speak. He simply stood beside the chair, held out the leather presenter containing the stack of declined receipts, and waited. Raymond looked at the receipts. Then, slowly, his head turned, and his eyes locked onto mine from across the table. The anger was gone, replaced by the raw, unguarded, and broken expression of a man who had just realized that the safety net he had planned to exploit was completely gone, and the structural ground beneath his feet was exactly as hard as he had always secretly feared. Raymond's chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as he stood up, his breathing heavy, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Elena," he whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of embarrassment and rage. "What did you do to the accounts? What did you tell the manager?" I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my eyes, and I didn't raise my voice. I sat perfectly still in my velvet seat, my hands folded calmly around my glass of plain ice water. "I didn't do anything to your accounts, Raymond," I said, my voice cutting through the silent ballroom like a steel blade through paper. "Your cards were declined by your own banking institution. That is a private contract reality between you and your creditors. I am an outside party." My mother broke into a loud, performative sob, her head dropping into her hands as she clutched her linen napkin. "Elena, after everything this family has endured, after we opened our hearts to let you back into our lives, how can you sit there with that cold face and do this to your own blood? Have you completely lost your humanity? Tell me, Mom," I said, leaning forward slightly, my tone perfectly even, completely devoid of anger. "Tell me in front of every single witness at this table, what exactly did you do to open your hearts in the last 4 years? What did you do for me during 1,000 days of absolute, freezing silence?" Chloe slammed her crystal glass down against the wood, wine spilling across the white linen. "This is so typical of you, Elena. You've always been a selfish monster. You think because you have a corporate title and a commercial firm that you can humiliate us in public. You always have to make everything about your money and your sick need for control." Aunt Sarah reached across the space, her fingers stretching toward my sleeve, her voice dropping into a desperate, pleading pitch. "Elena, dear, your stepfather is clearly experiencing a temporary business realignment. The family name is at stake tonight in this venue. Can't you just slide your card through the machine to clear the balance for the family's sake?" No, one single word. Clear, structural, final, and entirely without a hint of apology. The exact same tone I use when a commercial contractor tries to substitute inferior materials on a flagship build site. Raymond's shoulders suddenly slumped. The rage drained out of his posture, leaving behind a frail, exhausted man who looked 10 years older than he had when he walked into the ballroom. His voice dropped into a low, hollow whisper that carried a terrible, naked honesty. "Elena, please," he muttered, looking down at the table. "We are completely drowning. The boutique failure completely wiped out our commercial line. The secondary bank has already issued a final warning on the residential mortgage. We have nowhere left to turn." I looked at him across the wreckage of the feast he had engineered. I saw the scared, broken man behind the lifelong performance of high society dominance. For a fraction of a second, an old childhood ache flared in my chest. The memory of a little girl who would have done anything to make her parents smile, who would have broken her own bank account just to buy a single moment of peace at the dinner table. But then Raymond added the final, fatal sentence. "And you're just going to sit there and let us look like failures in front of our friends." The ache vanished instantly, replaced by a profound, freezing clarity. Even while drowning, even while facing the total collapse of his financial reality, his priority wasn't asking for my help. It was demanding my wallet to preserve his illusion. He didn't want my hand. He wanted my credit limit. I stood up from my chair, picking up my simple leather bag. I am truly sorry that you are struggling, Raymond. I mean that from a human perspective. But this dinner was never an invitation to heal a family relationship. This was a tactical shakedown. You didn't invite your daughter back into your lives because you missed her. You invited me because your secondary lien is due, and you built a trap with 14 witnesses to force a payment. My mother's performative crying stopped instantly, her eyes hardening into a cold, furious glare. I know about the private group chat, Mom, I continued, looking directly into her eyes. I know about the restoration project. I know that my presence tonight was calculated because you believed I wouldn't dare cause a public scene. You chose the wrong daughter. The entire table went completely white. Chloe's face drained of color, her eyes darting toward her pink phone. My mother's hand flew to her throat, her lips trembling. Raymond looked back down at the mahogany wood, unable to meet my gaze. If you need real, structural help, I said, looking at my parents one last time. I will fulfill my moral obligation as a daughter. I will pay for a licensed, independent financial trustee to audit your debts, and we will build a strict, transparent budget framework. No illusions, no country clubs, and absolutely no caviar. But I am not paying for this performance tonight. I didn't order this food, I wasn't told about this guest list, and I do not owe you my life. Nobody spoke. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, unbreakable, and permanent. I turned my back on the 14 members of the Vance family, walking with a calm, deliberate stride toward the double doors. I passed the floor manager, David, who offered a respectful nod as I cleared the threshold, and moved past the front display cases out into the warm evening air. Leo caught up with me right at the valet station, holding my signed receipt for the glass of water. Miss Vance, he said, his voice quiet, trembling slightly but carrying a profound sincerity. Thank you for seeing the work. I touched his shoulder gently. Keep your head up, Leo. Don't let the noise in there define your value. I stepped into my truck, turned the key in the ignition, and rolled the window down. The warm, humid air of the coast hit my face as the cicadas began their evening chorus in the manicured landscape trees of the Grandview Manor. I looked down at the simple white sticky note I had pressed to the center of my steering wheel that morning. One dinner, then home. My phone began to vibrate continuously on the passenger seat, a relentless, explosive cascade of text notifications, exclamation points, insults, and desperate voice notes from the extended family channels. It was the frantic, toxic fury of people who had been caught completely in the gears of their own design. I didn't open a single message. I didn't listen to a single second of their audio. I scrolled to the absolute bottom of the interface, tapped the red Leave Group button, and watched the screen clear into a peaceful white void. Elena has left the chat. The aftermath unfolded with a quiet, legal precision that no one could stop. My parents didn't call me the next day or the week after that. The social pride they carried wouldn't allow them to accept my offer of a financial counselor, because a counselor would demand the truth, and the truth was the one luxury they could never afford. 3 months later, the Vance residential property officially entered judicial foreclosure. The house was placed on the public market, and my parents moved into a modest, 2-bedroom rental apartment in a quiet town 40 minutes south of the city line. Chloe's luxury boutique fixtures were liquidated at a state auction, and she took a standard job answering telephone lines at a local medical clinic downtown. None of it was a reality that I had wished for them. I took no joy in their downsizing, and I took no pleasure in their sudden absence from the high society country clubs. But every single piece of their collapse was the natural, mathematical consequence of structural choices they had engineered long before I ever turned my truck into the parking lot of the Grandview Manor, and it was never my architecture to fix. 2 days ago, my development firm officially closed the escrow on our largest commercial acquisition, a beautiful, historic brick pavilion downtown that covers an entire city block. As I stood on the open-air balcony of my new upper office, looking down at the bustling commercial traffic below, I took a slow sip of plain, sparkling water from a crystal glass. My assistant walked in, setting a morning mail folder on my desk. Tucked inside the corporate letters was a small, handwritten envelope from my cousin Megan. the only family member who had remained silent during the ambush. I opened it. The note contained only 2 short sentences. That dinner was the first honest transaction this family has executed in 30 years. I am profoundly sorry I sat at that table. I set the note down, looking out over the downtown landscape I had spent a decade building with my own 2 hands, my own capital, and my own quiet resilience. When you spend your entire life being treated as the invisible financial foundation for other people's vanity, you eventually learn the ultimate law of human accounting. The most expensive asset you can ever purchase is another person's comfort at the absolute expense of your own self-respect. And the precise night you stop paying that tax is the exact night you finally become rich. Thank you for staying through the entire storm tonight on Silent Storm Stories. If you listen to every single minute of this 65-minute journey, do me a professional favor. Drop the word BOUNDARIE in the comments section below. It lets me know who understands the true, quiet architecture of an unbreakable baseline. Sleep well, keep your books balanced, and never let anyone else dictate your price at the table.